Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the Voice of Reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, as we watch the ongoing situation in and around Bakhmut, the situation looks incredibly dire for Ukrainian forces. The question right now is, do the Ukrainians have the ability to withdraw the multitude of brigades that appear to be trapped inside of the city of Bakhmut, the western outskirts and west central areas of Bakhmut, areas east of the main railway line that runs through the center of the city? We now know that the Russians are using some very heavy ordnance. They are dropping some very large precision-guided bombs on some of these underground bunker complexes the Ukrainians have created inside and around Bakhmut. And again, we have video evidence that the Russians have dropped some incredibly large ordnance on these targets. And the big issue, the big problem, the big challenge for Ukrainian forces is the ability to remove its forces from Bakhmut without being heavily damaged by Russian artillery fire and aircraft capability. If we look at some other maps, we'll go over here to the deep state map, and you can see clearly that the Russians have penetrated past the main defensive line that the Ukrainians had set up along the main railway station and the railway track that again runs through the center of Bakhmut. You can see here, and then we have reports now that indeed Russian forces have taken the main railway station and have penetrated the defensive barriers that the Ukrainians have set up. And while at the same time the Russians are hitting locales throughout this area, again with some of these very large 3,000-pound guided bombs that they are dropping from aircraft, some of which are glide bombs, some of which are Iskander systems that are being used against Ukrainian forces. And any time the Ukrainians attempt to withdraw its forces, especially along some of these main road routes, they come under some withering long-range artillery fire by Russian forces who have almost continuous drone coverage over this area. So this appears to be a political decision by the Zelensky government to maintain forces in Bakhmut. It sounds like both the United States and even the Ukrainian military had ideas about withdrawing from Bakhmut, capitulating Bakhmut, and setting up new defensive lines west of Bakhmut, as the situation in Bakhmut was just something that the Ukrainian army could not hold. So this was or at least appears to be, a political decision by the Ukrainian government to continue to hold out in Bakhmut. If we go over to the actual, again, back to the deployment map, you can see a host of forces that are deployed in Bakhmut. You have essentially elements of 1, 2, 3, probably in the neighborhood of, again, around 4 brigades that are trapped in this area. And again, we're seeing units of the Russian VDV, Russian airborne forces, continuing to conduct operations both to the north, to the south. We're seeing Wagner units that are also operating with Russian Spetsnaz forces and VDV forces, also to the east of the city as well. And again, the ability for the Ukrainians to maintain supply lines into Bakhmut are continued to be harried by Russian artillery and aircraft assets as well. So incredibly difficult situation right now for the Ukrainians. It appears to be that, at least on the surface, the Ukrainian government is preparing a media narrative for some sort of capitulation where we could see a fairly large-scale surrender of Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. Now, it is possible they could get those troops out of there, but day by day it's becoming more and more difficult for the Ukrainians to get those forces out of there, especially as the Russians continue to tighten things up here in the north and south. Let's look at this unit here. You have the 137th Guards Airborne Regiment, so you have elements of the 106th Guards Airborne Division, 217th Airborne Regiment of the 98th Airborne Division, 57th Motorized Rifle Brigade, and then PMC Wagner forces as well. Let's look at this one down here. Again, another regiment of the 106th Airborne. So you have elements and large elements of multiple Russian airborne divisions operating. You have, in all probability, Russian Spetsnaz forces and Russian motorized rifle forces supporting these Wagner forces as well. So again, very difficult situation. Now, we keep hearing about this offensive that is going to take place, and some sources indicate up to 200,000 Ukrainian troops are preparing for a major offensive operation against Russian-held territory. Now, where that's going to occur, difficult to say. It could come south, it could come east, but at the same time, keep in mind that the Russians are preparing as well. The Russians are mobilizing. The amount of Russian forces that are inside of Ukraine right now exceed 200,000 troops. So it is going to have to be a very large force construct of probably dozens of brigades that are going to have to be up to strength for the Ukrainians to launch said attack against some of these fortified Russian areas. And the Russians are fortifying many of these areas that they continue to hold, while at the same time they continue build up, meaning the Russians continue build up of their own forces for the prospect of a summer offensive, late summer offensive as well. So a very dynamic situation right now that we continue to monitor. We're continuing to see more and more Russian air assets coming into play. It looks like the Russians are modifying and adapting their air doctrine to what's happening on the ground right now. And the Russians are using its Air Force in a manner that we probably didn't see the Russian Air Force in a way that it conducted itself in the early campaign that we're seeing now. The Russians are very much focused on keeping spatial distance at times from Ukrainian forces to avoid casualties, and then use its ability, use its satellite assets, use its drone assets to then launch long-range precision fires against Ukrainian forces. There's one other issue to note as well. Do you remember early in the war where we kept hearing about the Bayraktar 2 drone, the TB2 drone being used that was provided by the Turks against Russian forces? Well, we're hearing and seeing much less use of drones by the Ukrainians against Russian forces. There's a reason for that. The Russians, with the use of its electronic warfare systems, air defense systems, have really made it difficult for the Ukrainians to launch these drones against Russian forces. Now, they are able to launch some of the more long-range drones in-house cruise missiles and possibly some Western-provided systems against targets deep into the Russian Federation. But these shorter-range systems are having difficulty operating against Russian forces now, especially the TB2. Whatever has happened with the TB2, the Russians have really focused on that system and appear to have, for all intents and purposes, taken it out of the skies for at least right now. But that's where we kind of sit today. Again, all eyes are on what's going to happen, obviously, in Bakhmut. We'll continue to report on what is happening. Again, thanks for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.